You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Coming into force today is a ban by South Korea on all fisheries imports from 8 Japanese prefectures. It comes amid concern over leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant. The plant has been hit by a series of water leaks in recent months. The earthquake and tsunami in March 2011 knocked out cooling systems to its reactors, 3 of which melted down. Water is now being pumped in to cool the reactors, but storing the resultant large quantities of radioactive water has proved a challenge for the operator, Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO. Japan has announced it will also invest £304 million into building a frozen wall around the plant to stop leaks of radioactive water. When it comes to nuclear power, any accident has consequences that last for generations. So, where does this put the argument for nuclear energy? What does Fukushima tell us about nuclear power generation? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Wade Allison, Emeritus Professor of Nuclear and Medical Physics at the University of Oxford. Also here in the studio is Anthony Froggatt, Senior Research Fellow for Energy and Environment at Chatham House. On the line from Japan is Michael Penn. He's the President of the Shingetsu News Agency. And on the line from Brussels is Jan van der Putte, who is a Greenpeace international radiation expert, and he led the Greenpeace radiation team in Fukushima. The news today about South Korea's ban on fisheries imports. Professor Allison, South Korea is worried about the levels of radiation. Should we be?
No, I don't think we should. I think we've been worried much too much. There's no reason really to treat the problems of nuclear radiation differently from the other problems that we have in the world, most of which are much more serious than the Fukushima disaster. Admittedly, a lot of investors and in Japan have lost their shirts off their backs with the loss of these reactors, but nobody has died. It's difficult to think of a disaster, so-called, in the world which has such a low accident rate.
In fact, you referred to that in a piece that you wrote for the BBC News website just after the accident happened in March 2011.
That's right.
And you made the point that the media concentrates on nuclear radiation from which no one has died. But in light of revelations over the last few months, do you still hold that view?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I've learnt more of what's happened in the past, but we've also seen that it's been announced that nobody has died as a result of the accident. And nobody will die either, because there are people, for instance, in the radiological accident in Goiânia in Brazil, where people have had much larger doses of radiation inside them, and there have been no cases of cancer.
Jan van der Putte, can I bring you in? You were there, you led the Greenpeace radiation team in Fukushima. How dangerous were the levels of radioactivity then, and how do they compare now?
Well, to quite a significant number of people, the radiation levels were too high for the people to stay there. And so more than 100,000 people have been evacuated. In our opinion, we think that if you talk about giving people advice to evacuate, you have to be very, very careful. And you need to be careful not to over-exaggerate, neither to underestimate the risks. For that reason, we've taken as Greenpeace, a quite conservative position, which is very much in line with what nuclear regulators around the world, including in the UK or in Japan, are saying about the risks. Positions we usually criticize as Greenpeace as underestimating the risks, but in a crisis situation, you have to be very careful. And for that reason, we took a very conservative line, which is in line with the nuclear regulations. In our opinion, there's still a few tens of thousands of people, I'm not talking about millions of people, who are still living in an area where the radiation levels are still too high. Not to force people to evacuate, but to leave them the choice. That means offer them the financial resources to make their own choice to leave or to stay. And that's where we're now still in a battle with the Japanese authorities.
What do you make of Professor Allison's comments that this has been over-egged somewhat?
In a marginal way, there have been some comments which have over-exaggerated the risks, but the cause of that, I clearly put the responsibility in the irresponsible way the Japanese government has tried to downplay the risks from the beginning, in a way that became very clear to the population that this was not credible. For instance, I was in end of March 2011, I was at the village of Iitate, and I spoke to the mayor of Iitate and explained to him that the levels of radiation were clearly too high. And we were criticized by the Japanese government of making such statements. But a month later, the Japanese government at once forced the people in a few days out of the village. That caused the population to lose its confidence in the authorities. This is a major problem, that the population doesn't have a clear reference who to trust and what to trust. And it feels for me now sometimes very satisfying that I can say to some people, yes, you are safe here, whereas they don't have any confidence in the authorities anymore. If we can say it, they believe us. If the authorities say it, they don't really believe them. It is satisfying for us to be able to do that, but it's actually the role of the authorities to do that.
Anthony Froggatt, I suppose 100 millisieverts per hour has been reported near the leaked water within the moat. What does that mean? Is that significant? And the point that Jan was saying was perhaps that really the response of the authorities changed over the course of 2 years, and perhaps people in Japan don't know or don't trust the response of the authorities and what they're telling them.
I think the question of trust is absolutely fundamental. And there was an opinion poll over the weekend in Japan that said 72% of those surveyed thought the government had acted too late, and 95% thought that it was still a serious problem. So what we see is a lack of trust and a perception that things are not moving forward. And it's not just within the public. There was also a recent report from the Science Committee in Japan that was criticizing the government and saying it was confused in its response. So, for example, the Minister of Health was responsible for looking at food safety, while the Minister of Environment was responsible for looking at contamination in the soil. So you have this cross lines of communication. So I think from the public perspective, from the scientific perspective in Japan, we're seeing that there is significant criticism. And even the regulator, the newly appointed regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, said that the situation was unstable. So 2 years later, problems are growing, which is leading to ongoing and in fact increasing public concern over the whole Fukushima power plant.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the aftermath of the nuclear disaster at Fukushima. With me in the studio is Wade Ellison, Emeritus Professor of Physics at the University of Oxford, Anthony Froggatt, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, Michael Penn, the President of Shingetsu News Agency in Tokyo, and Jan van der Putte, Greenpeace International Radiation Expert. So when they say, for instance, the levels of beta radiation are actually 18 times higher than initially thought, that really doesn't inspire confidence in people, does it?
It's a unique situation. And in some ways you can look back and look at the complication and degree of engineering problems that exist, let's say, around Chernobyl. So this occurred in 1986. And we're now 25 years plus further on, and they're still trying to address from an engineering perspective all the mechanisms that they need in order to contain it. And that is a mixture of, because it's a unique situation, but also because of some of the conditions that you observe and can see at the power plant. And so likewise in Fukushima, it is a unique situation. You have problems are uncovered as you do more investigation and you try to contain certain problems.
Michael Penn from Shingetsu News Agency, the statistic that Anthony mentions there, that it shows a significant level of distrust amongst the Japanese public. Has that been growing over the last 2 years?
The general notion that the public distrusts the government response to the Fukushima crisis is absolutely true. I think that this is borne out by the public opinion polls and from a lot of conversations. I mean, most Japanese simply don't trust the information that they get, and largely because they understand, and I think they're right about this, is that the government's always trying to make things sound like it's more under control than it really is. They're all, from the very beginning of the crisis, they were saying, "Oh, nuclear meltdowns? No, there was no reactor meltdowns. It's not going to happen." It took them like 2 months or something, or 3 months, to finally even admit that the meltdowns happened. So certainly the public doesn't have a great deal of trust in the government's response. Is it growing? I'm not sure I would say it's growing, because I think that now, once you get out of Fukushima prefecture and the region affected, most Japanese are moving on to other things in their lives. I mean, it's, in a way, the complaint I hear from many people is that people are beginning to forget about it. The distance from Tokyo psychologically is quite far from the region. Yes, there's distrust, but I don't think that it's necessarily growing at this point.
The trust business is indeed the problem, but the problem is that The regulations are wrong. They're wrong in the US, they're wrong from the UN, they're cautious. They're trying to appease the problem and tell people in a rather paternalistic way that radiation is all right, rather than actually educating them. Now, it's very interesting. I found it, go there, and the Japanese people responded to the tsunami and the earthquake brilliantly because they had been educated and they knew what to do when it happened. And although 18,000 people did die, people looked after one another, and there was a degree of responsibility in dealing with the accident. When it came to the radiation, nobody knew anything about it at any level, as far as I can see. And that is why there's this lack of confidence and this lack of trust.
But the lack of confidence also stemmed from there was no TEPCO and its regulators had no accident management plan in the event of earthquakes and tsunamis.
That's right.
So that was ham-fisted. But they survived the earthquake, but it couldn't survive the tsunami.
But the truth of the matter is that the radiation situation is safe, and it was safe, but the information was grossly mishandled so that the population didn't buy it.
So why does the Vice Chairman of the Japan Atomic Energy Commission say that the situation at the nuclear power plant, this is what he told the BBC last week, was an unprecedented crisis and it was getting worse?
I would disagree with him completely. I haven't spoken to him, but I would certainly take him on that.
Can I get your reaction to that, Jan? I mean, this comment from the Vice Chairman of the Japan Atomic Energy Commission, he is very concerned.
I think the main concern we all have is that the accident is not finished, but that was just one signal. It's clear that in December 2011, the Japanese government announced a so-called cold shutdown, which was pretty misleading terminology to explain to the population that the situation was stable. The situation is not stable and will not be stable for many years to come. There's still a lot of molten fuel in 3 reactors. There's one seriously damaged spent fuel pool of reactor number 4. If there is a major earthquake, in the worst case scenario, things could even become worse than they are today. And this sense of urgency is very important to make sure that we put sufficient pressure on the Japanese authorities to move ahead and not to stand still. The sense of urgency that was taken away or tried to take away by the Japanese government, the last 2 ones, is actually one part of the problem. And we need to get back to that sense of urgency, not to create a panic, but to make sure everything is done that needs to be done. And that includes to develop a plan to remove the fuel.
But Jan, I mean, isn't the problem that we've got 400 tons of irradiated water to store every day, and there are problems with the storage tanks? And I mean, what do you make of the science behind the proposal that the Japanese government are going to spend $500 million on this frozen wall aspect? I mean, is there not the danger that that could crack?
I mean, we haven't seen detailed feasibility studies and so on, so it's very difficult to know whether this will work or not. But it is clearly an accident in slow motion in the underground. That means there is an immense amount of highly radioactive water in the basements of the reactors, number 1 to 3. And if that gets in contact, even more than today, with the groundwater flow, that could create very significant problems in the longer term. Slowing down or avoiding that the flow of the groundwater gets in contact with that contaminated water is important. If the frozen wall is the best solution, there have been other proposals and there have been questions about how the Japanese industry will deal with that, keeping out foreign companies which might be better equipped to do that. So the whole management of that, there are very serious question marks there.
Anthony Froggatt, I mean, what's your view of this frozen wall idea? An expert I was speaking to the other day was telling me that this could crack, this could fissure, this could transport irradiated water in other ways, and there's no long-term guarantees over it.
I mean, I haven't seen the detailed assessments of it, but as a technique, it is used in other areas. So, for example, in tunnelling, you will freeze around the tunnel to stabilise the water to enable you to put in a concrete shell. So I think the purpose behind it is to enable a more long-term solution to be put in place. So what has been put forward is that this money will be injected into the plant, or the project will go ahead at a faster rate than was previously envisaged, freeze the ground to try to reduce the inflow of groundwater to enable other works to taking place. But as you said, there are questions over the long term, the stability of it. There are questions about how much energy is this going to need. You're going to be freezing quite large volumes of soil. And I think it shows the degree to which, in some ways, how serious the situation is, that a project that is an engineering challenge that is as significant as this is being put forward.
Michael Penn in Tokyo from the Shingitsu News Agency. Do people in Japan perhaps feel that this idea, this money that the Japanese government is throwing in tackling this with this idea of the frozen wall is somehow linked to its Olympic bid? And certainly there were strong assurances by the Japanese government that that Fukushima will not be an issue, that radiation will not be an issue for those games. I mean, do you see any kind of link there?
I haven't heard specifically about, say, a link between the frozen wall and the Olympics issue, although there's a lot of interesting issues circling around those points. I mean, while I do believe that Prime Minister Abe is correct to say that, the Fukushima nuclear crisis is going to have no impact, basically, on the games themselves, some of the claims he made about where things stand today were just simply untrue. He told some highly questionable things to the Olympic Committee about what's going on right now. I do think that, generally speaking, the Japanese are willing to support spending a lot of money to fix the problem because they remain fearful of radiation. They're worried about its long-term effects. They're quite happy to see the government get more directly involved and to take it out of TEPCO's hands, because if there's mistrust towards the government, there's even more mistrust towards TEPCO.
It's a very important issue in terms of how you take it forward and the roles and responsibilities of different energy companies and the Japanese government. I mean, what we saw earlier this year was proposals to reform the power sector in Japan abandoned. And that was in part because of the elections around the upper house. It's still a question mark of whether or not it's going to go forward. And I think this is a very important point, because if we are to change the power sector in Japan, then you need to move away from the prefectures having virtual monopolies of the utilities to enable more energy companies to come in. And I think a similar situation exists in relation to TEPCO. The Japanese government doesn't want to fully take over the utility for fear that it will then have to take responsibility for all of the situation in Fukushima. So in some ways it's keeping it at arm's length, but which is in some ways not really fundamentally addressing the problem.
Cooperation between the government and someone like TEPCO is crucial to developing nuclear energy. But I mean, Professor Allison, I know you've made the point that you don't believe the levels of radiation are dangerous, but where does this put the argument for nuclear energy in the future? Because several countries in Europe have shut down their programs, their nuclear programs. This is having an impact on reputation.
Well, let's put it this way. Let's look at on the big scale. I think the problems that are facing the world are socio-economic stability, instability and climate change and so on. I don't think radiation belongs in that list. We need nuclear power to solve those problems, and for desalination plants and the irradiation of food and things like that, which would be an enormous step forward in the way that we live on this planet.
But when Belgium and Italy and Switzerland move away from nuclear energy in connection with the reputational damage to the sector after Japan, you're saying that they're wrong to do that?
I am saying they're wrong to do that. I think we have a massive educational problem, and I think that scientists, and I include myself in that, have neglected the problem which happened in earlier centuries of helping the population and informing them about the dangers and risks and so on of what they were doing. Nuclear has been treated paternalistically and with a military side to it, and people don't know about it. Look at fire. 25,000 years ago, people decided that in spite of the fact that fire is very dangerous indeed, it was still better to have cooked food and a warm house, and we would not be where we are today if we had turned down the use of fire in the home.
Anthony Froggatt, I'd like to quickly ask you, though. I mean, despite some countries rolling back their nuclear program, the International Atomic Energy Agency expects at least 90 additional nuclear power reactors to join the 430 or so that are now in operation. Given what's happened in a highly westernized country like Japan, shouldn't we be concerned at developing countries getting on board with nuclear energy if this can happen in one of the most westernized countries in the world?
First, in terms of the International Atomic Energy Agency, I mean, I think historically they have been over-optimistic in terms of the number of projects that are likely to come online. But one of the key issues regarding nuclear safety internationally is that the International Atomic Energy Agency, which puts forward guidelines, but there is no binding nuclear safety standard internationally. Although countries may be encouraged to go for higher safety standards, there is no actual requirement. And you can see that in certain places around the world where countries that wish to build nuclear power plants are not necessarily going for the state-of-the-art design. They're going for ones that were designed in the 1960s and 1970s. So it is definitely a problem that there isn't a universal nuclear safety standard. And one of the issues that Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, said post-Fukushima was exactly that, is if a country like Japan can experience this situation and is unable to adequately control it, then this was one of her rationales for her switch. Because prior to Fukushima, her party was very pro-nuclear. And then afterwards they said, actually, this wasn't the right way forward for Germany.
Yeah, Professor Allison, I mean, why should governments look at building nuclear plants? There are many other sources of energy generation. Why turn to the slowest, most expensive and inflexible and riskiest option when perhaps in 100 years' time, when wind turbines or other energy sources like solar energy, biomass and stuff are up and running, we might look back at this time when we were obsessed with nuclear energy with a little bit perplexed. And the consequences of nuclear energy are felt for hundreds of years.
I would take issue with almost every phrase in what you have just said. For a start, because nuclear safety standards try to appease people's fears rather than inform them and educate them, the levels of safety have got tighter and tighter and tighter. They're now several hundred times tighter than they were in the 1950s, and there is no scientific reason for that other than to placate people's fears. Now, it's very important that people aren't afraid, but we've done it the wrong way. And that has made it extremely expensive. I don't know what the number is, but something like half of the cost of nuclear power is associated with maintaining and implementing the safety standards. So when it is said that it's expensive, I disagree with that.
But storing the waste products is a big chunk of the price.
No, because if radiation is not frightening, you're not so worried about storing the waste products. There's 1 million times less waste product from a nuclear reactor than there is from a fossil fuel plant. And from a fossil fuel plant, it goes straight into the atmosphere. Now, admittedly, I have to agree we don't really know how bad the global warming problem is, but it certainly worries me a lot. But
in terms of people being frightened, Michael Penn in Tokyo, people in Japan are frightened. In fact, there was a poll last week which found out that a considerable proportion of people thought that more people in Fukushima are likely to have died as a result of health problems related to nuclear evacuation than actually died in the quake and tsunami itself.
In his first comments, Professor Allison said that nobody died as a result of the Fukushima accident. And actually, a couple of Japanese politicians have gotten in trouble saying something very similar. It needs to be understood that what that means is nobody was subjected to enough radiation that they immediately got sick and died. But actually, more than 1,000 people have died as a result of the accident, many of them involved in the evacuation, old people who basically were sent to evacuation centers and had illnesses and other things. Some people committed suicide. So, the human cost is definitely there. The Japanese public thinks radiation is dangerous, and they're worried about the long-term effects. They're worried about what kind of cancers might come up in 10 or 20 years. People in Fukushima are somewhat resigned to the situation. I mean, they're like, well, there's nothing we can do. We live here. This is our home. So they try not to think about it much. But definitely the tension and the fear exists in Japanese society.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the aftermath of the nuclear disaster in Fukushima with Wade Allison, Anthony Froggatt, Michael Penn and Jan van der Putte. And Jan van der Putte, what does Fukushima say about the future of nuclear energy as a clean energy source? Are you confident lessons can be learned and that we can move on?
Well, the fact today is that only one nuclear reactor is operating today in Japan. There were 54 before the accident. And in a few days, there will be 0 nuclear reactors operating in Japan. And that's at the moment that there is a very pro-nuclear government. Having a pro-nuclear politics doesn't really change the fact that there are very serious safety concerns around the reactors in Japan. To mention just one is that new fault lines have been discovered right beneath several reactors in Japan, which makes them legally not fit to operate anymore. It has been estimated that at least 20 reactors in Japan will never restart anyway. Whether you have a pro or an anti-nuclear government will not change that fact. That means that there is a psychological shock that nuclear power is not a reliable source of electricity. Japan has to manage without. And this shock has had its implications, for instance, also in France, which is heavily dependent on nuclear power for 75% of its annual electricity production. And so the Hollande administration government has decided to reduce its dependency, not because on nuclear power from 75 to about 50%. That's not an anti-nuclear move. That's just the fear that got into the uncertainty about the electricity supply to the French economy and to the French households. This is something new, and I think this is a part of the economics, of course, that a new reactor in the UK will have to be heavily subsidized. It's more expensive than onshore wind turbines. We are past a certain point where the cost of renewables are going down and the cost of nuclear are escalating. And we are past a certain point where nuclear can still play a significant role in the future.
Just quickly, Anthony Froggatt, so nuclear energy, from what Jan was saying there, will continue to play a role, but it seems to be playing less of a role, and that other energy forms will be part of the energy mix. But countries like France, which rely on most of their energy from nuclear plants, they won't be able to do that anymore.
I think what we're likely to see is a diminishing role, and the question is how low will it go with nuclear? I mean, I think there is competing issues. There is the question of the Fukushima impact, what that does for the confidence of investors and what that does for economics. There is the question of renewables that Jan van Putte mentioned that continue to fall in price. And there's also the shale gas question. At what price will shale gas be extracted and how acceptable that is from a climate change perspective? But it's very clear in the United States that wished to go ahead with, about 10 years ago, we're planning to build many reactors, are now building 1 or 2, but are also starting to close reactors. This year, 4 reactors has been closed for economic reasons in the United States. So in Europe, in North America, and in other parts of the world, we're seeing a diminishing role for nuclear going forward.
I'd just like to thank our guests. That's Anthony Froggatt, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, Wade Allison, Emeritus Professor of Physics at University of Oxford, and on the line from Tokyo, Michael Penn, the President of the Shingitsu News Agency, and on the line from Brussels, Jan van der Putte, who is a Greenpeace international radiation expert who led the Greenpeace radiation team in Fukushima. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.
With what nuclear regulators around the world, including in the UK or in Japan, are saying about the risks. Positions we usually criticize as Greenpeace as underestimating the risk, but in a crisis situation, you have to be very careful. And for that reason, we took a very conservative line, which is in line with the nuclear regulations. In our opinion, there's still a few tens of thousands of people, I'm not talking about millions of people, who are still living in an area where the radiation levels are still too high. Not to force people to evacuate, but to leave them the choice. That means offer them the financial resources to make their own choice to leave or to stay. And that's where we're now still in a battle with the Japanese authorities.
What do you make of Professor Allison's comments that this has been over-egged somewhat?
In a marginal way, there have been some comments which have
around the plant to stop leaks of radioactive water. When it comes to nuclear power, any accident has consequences that last for generations. So Where does this put the argument for nuclear energy? What does Fukushima tell us about nuclear power generation? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Wade Allison, Emeritus Professor of Nuclear and Medical Physics at the University of Oxford. Also here in the studio is Anthony Froggatt, Senior Research Fellow for Energy and Environment at Chatham House. On the line from Japan is Michael Penn. He's the president of the Shingetsu News Agency. And on the line from Brussels is Jan van der Putte, who is a Greenpeace international radiation expert, and he led the Greenpeace radiation team in Fukushima. The news today about South Korea's ban on fisheries imports. Professor Allison, South Korea is worried about the levels of radiation. Should we be?
No, I don't think we should. I think we've been worried much too much. There's no reason.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Coming into force today is a ban by South Korea on all fisheries imports from 8 Japanese prefectures. It comes amid concern over leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant. The plant has been hit by a series of water leaks in recent months. The earthquake and tsunami in March 2011 knocked out cooling systems to its reactors, 3 of which melted down. Water is now being pumped in to cool the reactors, but storing the resultant large quantities of radioactive water has proved a challenge for the operator, Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO. Japan has announced it will also invest £304 million into building a frozen wall.
Really, to treat the problems of nuclear radiation differently from the other problems that we have in the world, most of which are much more serious than the Fukushima disaster. Admittedly, a lot of investors and in Japan have lost their shirts off their backs with the loss of these reactors, but nobody has died. It's difficult to think of a disaster, so-called, in the world which has such a low accident rate.
In fact, you referred to that in a piece that you wrote for the BBC News website just after the accident happened in March 2011.
That's right.
And you made the point that the media concentrates on nuclear radiation from which no one has died. But in light of revelations over the last few months, do you still hold that view?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I've learnt more of what's happened in the past, but we've also seen that it's been announced that nobody has died as a result of the accident. And nobody will die either, because there are people, for instance, in the radiological accident in Goiânia in Brazil, where people have had much larger doses of radiation inside them, and there have been no cases of cancer.
Jan van der Putte, can I bring you in? You were there, you led the Greenpeace radiation team in Fukushima. How dangerous were the levels of radioactivity then, and how do they compare now?
Well, to quite significant number of people, the radiation levels were too high for the people to stay there. And so more than 100,000 people have been evacuated. In our opinion, we think that if you talk about giving people advice to evacuate, you have to be very, very careful. And you need to be careful not to over-exaggerate, neither to underestimate the risks. For that reason, we've taken as Greenpeace, a quite conservative position, which is very much in line